The job that falls for me to do to start off with is to try to justify these huge figures that we've come up with of £120 billion a year of hidden costs in the UK food system, because it's something like 30 times higher than previous best estimates about 10 or 15 years ago. And I do want to try to make you understand that we're not just irresponsible campaigners who've been plucking figures out of the air. What we've done essentially, that's different from anyone else, is that we've added in the cost of diet-related disease. Roughly half of all the costs relate to food production, and a fairly significant proportion to diet-related disease. And the production costs are much higher because, A, we've been able to use studies which have been published in the last 10 years, which have often extended the remit of the things they've looked at. Secondly, we've updated older studies for inflation to 2015 prices throughout, so we're looking at the annual costs in 2015 in this report. And we've also taken, for example, where carbon costs are involved, we've used a very controversial figure for the price of carbon of £173 a tonne, whereas a lot of studies are just using a price of about £50 a tonne. And we've done that on the basis of some research from two academics from Stanford University in the US, which particularly impressed us, who factored in the social costs of carbon as well as just the direct environmental costs. We're not saying these are absolute figures. What we're saying is that these are representative of the sort of hidden costs that are in the food system. And in many cases where we've looked at studies, for example, the European Nitrogen Assessment, which has a huge range of between 35 billion and 230 billion, that's as close as a team of 230 academics could put the cost of reactive nitrogen from agricultural fertilizer. We've taken a midpoint of that figure. In a few situations, we've taken the highest range of an estimate where the academics themselves identified other costs which they weren't able to quantify, which we felt was significant, which justified us using the higher figures. Looking at the different components, first of all, natural capital degradation, we're looking here at pollution, soil degradation, damage to the environment, 30 billion, biodiversity loss, 12.75 billion. This is UK only. And food production related public health costs, here we're looking at things like antibiotic resistance from use of antibiotics, we're looking at food poisoning. There's one study looking at OP pesticides, one group of studies looking at OP pesticides, which comes up with very high figures. And taken together, those come to exactly half our total. Then here we've got the diet related costs, so I'll talk about more about those in a moment or two. Then we've got agriculture subsidies and regulation together. We've got a split between subsidies and regulation in the detailed work, and imported food. Now we're pretty sure the imported food figures are a significant underestimate, but it's the best we can do because we import food from 140 something countries in the UK, and we just haven't got the resources, and there isn't the data available to do a breakdown of all the production issues. So we've simply extrapolated for the net value of imported food, that's the exports minus the imports minus exports, and done that at the same rate as in the UK. Same figures again, but tabulated, they come just over £120 billion. Looking at what we spend on food, you'll find studies that refer to £201 billion for food, but they include alcohol, and they also include the full costs of catering. And we've used studies which show that roughly, when you're looking at, say, dining out, about 30% of the cost of your meal will actually be the cost of the food. The rest will be people paying people to wash up and serve you the food and cook it and so on. So we haven't cooked the books, I can assure you. It just happens by complete chance that they've come out very similar figures. And so we've got 120.14 billion on the food spend and 120.25 billion on the negative externalities. Looking at this pound for pound, the natural capital degradation aspect is just over 25 pence in every pound. That's an extra 25 pence. You spend a pound, an extra 25 pence goes on the loss, the damage to the environment. But that doesn't include biodiversity loss, which is another 10.6 pence. Production-related ill health, as I just mentioned a moment ago, is 13.4 pence. Diet-related disease, 37.3 pence. Imported food, 7.8 pence. Farm support payments, 2.5 pence. Regulation and research, 2.7 pence. Comes to £1. And the one point just to make here, particularly, which has really quite surprised us, given how much national publicity there's been on the cost of agricultural subsidies, is that actually here we can see that farm support payments make up only 2.5% of this total extra hidden costs which we're all paying. And that's led us to make a recommendation that actually we should not be scrapping support payments, public support payments for food production, but we should, of course, be using that money in a far more constructive way than we have in the past to achieve much greater sustainability goals in terms of production and much greater diet health goals in relation to food consumption. Looking at some of these in more detail, here's the natural capital degradation broken down. Greenhouse gases and air pollution, that's ammonia particularly, 80% of which comes from intensive livestock production, is a major atmospheric pollutant contributing to respiratory diseases and several 100,000 deaths a year across Europe in total, but also including methane from ruminants and nitrous oxide from the use of nitrogen fertilizer and soils that have been over-fertilized with nitrogen. Food waste, this figure here relates to from a study which relates to the lost economic value of something like 12 million tonnes of food a year, which we throw away in this country. It doesn't actually include the additional greenhouse. In 2015, by scientists at Cranfield University, came up with a figure of 1.33 billion. Now, that was only for England and Wales, so all we've been able to do is, there's no data for Northern Ireland and Scotland, is we've actually extrapolated that to those two countries on the assumption that the soil carbon losses are the same and the degradation is the same. We think, in fact, based on a conversation with the scientists, they could be higher because there's so much more carbon in the soils in those countries. And then we've also used our higher figure for soil carbon, which works out at about $500 million of that figure is due to our inflated figure for the cost of the carbon that's being lost. So we've gone from 14 million as a first estimate, where DEFRA was saying, people were saying it's not a really big problem, to an estimate here within 15 years showing it's well over £3 billion. And that's sort of one good example of how these costs have become so much higher. Water costs attributable to agriculture, we're talking about here eutrophication of waterways, pollution of water from nitrates, phosphates and slurry and so on, 1.49 billion, and that comes to just over 30 billion in total. Biodiversity loss has been one of our weakest points in the study because despite many, many studies looking at how serious the biodiversity loss is in the UK, none of them have actually put costs on that. There's one or two studies that looked at pollinating insect loss, but we've had to get this figure, again rather crudely. There's one European-wide study which came up with a figure, and we've simply taken a pro rata proportion of that based on the land area in the UK. So that could be an underestimate or it could be a significant overestimate. It's the best we can do at the moment. But we just included that photograph of oilseed rape because it illustrates so many different aspects about biodiversity loss. The loss of hedgerows, the fact the fields have got so much bigger, the use of high nitrogen fertilizer, which is contributing to biodiversity loss, and the use of agrochemicals, both things like glyphosate and neonicotinoids, or now they're using synthetic pyrethroids, all of which are having negative impacts on biodiversity. Food production-related ill health, we've struggled with how to deal with some of these issues because most people just put food diet-related disease in one category, but we decided that it was reasonable to take these particular aspects out of that. Antibiotic resistance. There's a study that estimates the total impact of antibiotic resistance in the UK on the human population is costing about £11 billion a year at the moment. Now, we've taken something like 20% of that on the basis of a US study which estimated, I think, that 20% of antibiotic-resistant infections in the US were caused by antibiotic use in agriculture. It's very difficult to get an accurate figure on this, but it gives us some sort of starting point to work from. Food poisoning, this is based on UK data from the Health Protection Agency. As most people know, Campylobacter from chickens is the biggest single cause of that, but there are other aspects as well. These are all based on studies. Organophosphate pesticides is perhaps one of the most controversial figures, particularly considering how big the figure is. But there's a group of studies by international scientists which have looked at the damaging impact of organophosphate pesticides in Europe as a whole. And they came up with a figure of close to 200 billion euros a year. And what surprised us to find out is that actually roughly 50% of all pesticides contain organophosphates, including Roundup. Glyphosate is organophosphate. There's a wide range of different types of organophosphates, and they probably don't all have the same impact. But nevertheless, this isn't really the sheep, the people who've been getting problems with dipping sheep, is it would be a very small part of this. This is largely due to their estimate of developmental problems in children who are exposed to OPs in the environment because of their widespread use in the food system and the fact that it leads to a loss of IQ. Colon cancer from nitrates in drinking water, a very small figure there, 43.5 million. This is based on a previous study from the 1990s. Nitrates in the UK no longer exceed the EU's 50 parts per million limit, but they do significantly exceed the recommended level of 25 parts per million. And there's one study which estimates that roughly 3% of bowel cancer cases could be attributed to nitrates in water, again across the EU as a whole, so we've had to just take that figure for the UK. Diet-related disease here, we all know the different components of that. And what we're looking at here is we've only been able to include things where there are studies which give us a reasonably accurate breakdown of how much of a particular problem relates to the diet and how much relates to lifestyle choices like lack of exercise or smoking or too much alcohol or so on. So we're looking in most cases at roughly 50% of the total cost of those diseases to society. And one thing I'd just add is that there's a further subdivision of this which really should be made, which is that almost all of these have a component which is to do with food quality, and almost no one has worked on this yet. But if you take, for example, omega-3, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which there's a lot of research to suggest that are very beneficial in reducing incidence of these sort of diseases. We've seen, because of grain feeding of animals, we've seen the amount of omega-3 coming from meat decline by something like 80% over the last 50 years. And even over the last 5 years, the amount of omega-3 in farm salmon has halved. And farm salmon was already only containing about half as much as wild salmon. So that we're in a situation where we're probably really building up a problem. And there's other aspects that could be mentioned in terms of B vitamins from the way that we're processing flour and so on. Imported food, surprisingly, the best figure was from one study by True Cost for a European initiative has put a figure of £210 million a year as the externalities on palm oil, the cost of the environmental cost of its production. We feel it's an underestimate, but we haven't had time to challenge that in any proper way. And now looking at the farm support payments, 3.36 billion, of which roughly just under around about 3 billion in 2015 was actual payments to farmers. Positive externality, we have not dealt with positive externalities. It's a major deficiency of this report, but we decided we simply didn't have the resources or time to do that. Obviously, in order to assess farming systems, one has to look at the beneficial effects in terms of yield production, the quality of the food, the impact on the environment. A very good example is the benefits of pollinating insects, which have been quantified at up to 690 million a year in the UK, and we're losing some of that. We've quoted a few US figures there as well. But there's a lot more besides, and it's really the subject of another report. But before we could do that, or before anyone could do it, there's a lot more academic research really needs to be done. We've also done a quick review of social and cultural externalities, which we've not attempted to cost because there's simply a paucity of academic research in this area. But we've looked at that most of the costs of animal welfare are included within the report. For example, food poisoning, ammonia emissions, which are associated with intensive production systems, something that Compassionate World Farming has pointed out in the past. They're actually built into our other categories. But we've actually looked at the other slightly more esoteric aspects of food systems like that, whether it's having a more subtle impact on our lives. Mental health costs the UK £100 billion a year. And we make the argument that both the decline of small farms, the decreasing opportunity for people to work on the land are having a negative impact on mental health, which changing that round could help to reverse. And we've also looked at the pressures on farmers, which are leading to depression, and one UK farmer committing suicide every week, one French farmer committing suicide every 2 days, basically because they're being driven to bankruptcy by a food system which doesn't pay them for the cost of production. Our main recommendations are that in future, if we do leave the EU, that UK agricultural policy should be based on an honest assessment of the costs and benefits of different production systems. That public subsidies should be redirected in a way that will discourage environmentally damaging practices towards those which will encourage food types and food systems which are beneficial to the public. And we do need to make the point here that this is the sort of thing that a lot of groups are saying, but very few of them are actually pointing out that we need to change, we need to look at food production. Many of them are thinking about the green frills in agriculture, which are very nice, the walls, the hedges, the wildlife habitat, but we're talking about something far more fundamental so that we've got food security and sustainable food production in the future. And we would argue that one of the best ways, if politically possible, to address this problem is to tax the most damaging impacts. And rather than taxes on meat, as some people have suggested, our major recommendation is there should be a tax on nitrogen fertilizer. Before they joined the European Union, 3 European countries were actually putting a tax on nitrogen fertilizer already. It's perfectly technically possible to do that, and we're arguing that the money could be hypothecated and used to pay farmers to improve their practices, particularly in relation to soil carbon sequestration, which has been defined by scientists. And there's the bill, like a receipt from a supermarket, and thank you very much.